November 1968. The Mekong Delta, somewhere near the Bassac River. Staff Sergeant Raymond Cole, a by-the-book Army intelligence officer, had processed hundreds of after-action reports. Enemy killed in action, weapons captured, villages secured. Standard paperwork for a standard war. But the document on his desk that morning made him reach for his coffee with a trembling hand. The report claimed that a single SEAL squad had penetrated a heavily guarded NVA compound, neutralized 11 sentries, and extracted a high-value target. Total shots fired by the enemy, 0. Total alarms raised, 0. Time elapsed from first contact to extraction, 23 minutes. Cole read the final line 3 times. Suppressed weapons employed, no ballistic evidence recovered. He had heard whispers about these men, the operators who didn't wear boots, the ghosts who rose from the river at night. But this was something else. This suggested the Americans possessed a weapon that could erase a man from existence without making a sound. The weapon was real. The Navy called it the Mark 22 Mod 0. The operators who carried it into the swamps called it the Hush Puppy. The Vietnamese had their own name. They called it Whispering Death. And the story of how this classified pistol came to terrorize the Viet Cong begins not in some secret Pentagon laboratory, but with a brutal truth that the military brass refused to accept. The standard-issue knife was getting American operators killed. The Mekong Delta, 1968. A moonless night so black you couldn't see your own hand. 3 Navy SEALs slid through the water like crocodiles, their faces painted green, their bodies submerged to the nose. 50 meters ahead stood an NVA sentry, AK-47 slung across his chest, completely unaware that he had less than 90 seconds to live. The point man raised a pistol from the water. No standard military sidearm. This was something else entirely. Something the Pentagon would deny existed for the next 30 years. He squeezed the trigger. A sound no louder than a heavy book dropping on carpet. The sentry crumpled without a cry, without a warning shot, without alerting the 43 enemy soldiers sleeping in the hooch behind him. The SEALs had just used the most classified handgun in the American arsenal. They called it the Hush Puppy. The Vietnamese had another name for it. They called it Whispering Death. But this was merely the opening act of a story the government tried to bury forever. The problem that nobody wanted to admit. The year was 1963, and the United States Navy had a serious problem. The newly formed SEAL teams, barely 2 years old, were being sent into the most hostile territory on Earth with equipment designed for conventional warfare. Every mission into the Mekong Delta required the same brutal calculation. How do you eliminate enemy sentries without alerting the entire province? The answer, according to standard military doctrine, was the knife. Get close, strike fast, move on. But the brass sitting in their air-conditioned offices at MACV headquarters had clearly never tried to knife fight a trained NVA soldier in waist-deep swamp water while carrying 60 pounds of gear. The SEAL operators knew the truth that the Pentagon refused to acknowledge. Knife eliminations looked great in Hollywood movies, but in the real world, they were messy, unpredictable, and dangerously loud. A man being neutralized with a blade does not go quietly into the night. He thrashes, he gurgles, he grabs at his attacker. And in the jungle, where sound travels like a bullet, even a 30-second struggle could compromise an entire operation. And that's when someone at Langley decided to break every rule in the book. The CIA's dirty little secret. While the Navy was still filling out requisition forms in triplicate, the Central Intelligence Agency had already solved this problem. In the shadows of the Phoenix program, CIA operatives and their provincial reconnaissance units had been conducting targeted eliminations across South Vietnam since 1965, and they weren't using knives. They had access to a weapon that officially didn't exist. A modified Smith & Wesson Model 39 pistol, fitted with a suppressor so effective that it reduced the report to barely 40 decibels. For comparison, a normal conversation registers at about 60 decibels. This pistol was literally quieter than 2 people talking. The CIA called it various things in their classified cables, the Mark 22, the Hush Puppy. But the Vietnamese civilians who witnessed its work gave it a name that would echo through the Delta for years: Con Ma, the Ghost. What happened next would change the war forever. Stories spread through villages like wildfire. American demons who could pass a sentry without being seen and leave him lifeless without a sound. Soldiers who refused to guard at night because they knew the ghost would find them. Entire NVA units that would abandon positions rather than face another night of silent visitors from the water. The psychological impact was devastating, and that was exactly the point. But the SEALs were watching, and they wanted in. The Battle of the Requisition Forms. This is where the story reveals the absurd reality of fighting a secret war inside a conventional military structure. The Navy SEALs knew the CIA had effective suppressed pistols. The SEALs were working alongside CIA operatives in the Phoenix program. Logic dictated that the SEALs should simply be issued the same weapons, but logic had no place in the Pentagon's procurement system. The official Navy position in 1966 was that suppressed weapons were _1_ and therefore inappropriate for military personnel. Let that sink in. The same Navy that was sending SEALs to conduct nighttime ambushes, prisoner snatches, and targeted raids somehow found suppressed pistols morally questionable. The brass had drawn a line. The SEALs were about to erase it. The operators on the ground responded the way they always did when faced with bureaucratic stupidity. They ignored it completely. Teams began to weapons from their CIA counterparts. Others purchased commercial suppressors through unofficial channels and modified their personal sidearms. A few enterprising platoons even fabricated their own suppressors from materials scavenged in Saigon. The brass was furious. Memos flew back and forth between Coronado and Washington, demanding explanations for the _3_ appearing in after-action reports. But then came the night that shut everyone up. The night that changed everything. November 19, 1967. SEAL Team 2's 7th Platoon received intelligence about a high-value target. A senior NVA tax collector operating out of a village in Kien Hoa Province. This man had been responsible for the execution of 14 village chiefs who refused to cooperate with the Viet Cong. He was protected by a 12-man security detail and believed himself untouchable. The mission parameters were simple: capture or eliminate. No collateral damage, no witnesses, and absolutely no alert to the 200 NVA soldiers stationed less than 1 kilometer away. Lieutenant Jake Reinboldt's squad inserted by sampan at 0200 hours. The approach took 3 hours through chest-deep mud and water infested with snakes that the operators had learned to ignore. At 0515, they reached the target village. 8 hooches, 2 sentries visible, an unknown number of additional guards in the darkness. What happened in the next 4 minutes would become legend. Reinboldt's point man carried one of the borrowed CIA pistols. He eliminated the first sentry from 17 meters. The only sound was the mechanical cycling of the slide. The second sentry turned at the soft thump of his comrade's body hitting the ground. He never completed the turn. 2 rounds, center mass, before he could unsling his rifle. The squad moved through the village like smoke. 4 more guards eliminated in their sleeping positions. No alarms, no shots fired in response. The tax collector was found in the largest hooch, surrounded by documents that would later yield intelligence on the entire Viet Cong infrastructure in 3 provinces. He was taken alive, extracted by helicopter at first light, and delivered to the Provincial Interrogation Center. The official report listed the operation as a _5_. The suppressed pistols were never mentioned, but word got back to Washington. And suddenly, everything changed. The specifications of silence. By early 1968, the Navy had finally authorized the development of an official suppressed pistol for SEAL operations. The contract went to Smith & Wesson, with technical input from operators who had actually used such weapons in combat. The result was the Mark 22 Mod 0, and its specifications read like something from a spy novel. The base weapon was a modified Model 39 semi-automatic, 9mm parabellum, single-stack magazine holding 8 rounds. But the modifications transformed it into something entirely different. The barrel was extended and threaded to accept a custom suppressor manufactured by the Naval Ordnance Laboratory. This suppressor used a series of wire mesh baffles that disrupted the propellant gases, reducing the sound signature to approximately 37 decibels at the muzzle. But here's the detail that made operators' eyes widen. The slide could be locked in the forward position using a special lever, preventing the mechanical noise of the action cycling. This meant the pistol became a single-shot weapon, requiring manual cycling between rounds, but it also meant the only sound was the bullet itself leaving the barrel. And with subsonic ammunition, even that sound was reduced to almost nothing. The sights were fitted with luminous tritium inserts for low-light acquisition. The grip panels were checkered walnut, later replaced with rubber for better purchase when wet. The entire package weighed just under 2.5 pounds, with a full magazine and suppressor attached. It was compact enough to fit in a thigh holster, rugged enough to survive immersion in salt water, and accurate enough to guarantee a first-round elimination at 25 meters. And yet the weapon itself was only half the equation. The ammunition that made it deadly. The Mark 22 was designed to fire a very specific round, the Mark 144 Mod 0, a subsonic 9mm cartridge that traveled at approximately 900 feet per second. This was critical. Standard 9mm ammunition travels at around 1,200 feet per second, breaking the sound barrier and creating the characteristic _6_ that reveals a shooter's position. The subsonic round eliminated this ballistic signature entirely. The only sound remaining was the suppressor's muffled cough and the mechanical click of the slide if it was allowed to cycle. But slower bullets created a new problem that demanded a brutal solution. Lower velocity meant reduced energy at the target. The SEALs compensated through shot placement and volume of fire. Standard operating procedure called for 2 rounds to the upper chest, followed by a third to the head if the target remained mobile. This '7 became so ingrained that operators could execute it in under 2 seconds. The heavy 147-grain projectile, while slower, actually had superior penetration characteristics against soft targets. NVA soldiers wearing the typical black pajamas and light web gear offered no meaningful resistance to the round. The suppressor itself required careful maintenance. Each tube was rated for approximately 30 rounds before the baffles began to degrade and sound levels increased. SEAL platoons carried multiple suppressors on extended operations, swapping them out to maintain optimum noise reduction. The spent suppressors were not discarded in the field. They were collected and returned for refurbishment, preventing the enemy from recovering examples of this classified technology. And that secrecy existed for one terrifying reason: the Phoenix program connection. The Mark 22 did not exist in isolation. It was purpose-built for one of the most controversial operations of the Vietnam War. The Phoenix program, known officially as the Intelligence Coordination and Exploitation Program, was designed to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure. In practice, this meant locating the shadow government that the communists had established throughout South Vietnam. Tax collectors, political officers, recruitment cadre, intelligence operatives. These were not soldiers in the conventional sense. They wore no uniforms, carried no weapons openly, and blended into the civilian population. Eliminating them required a different kind of warfare, the kind that never made the evening news. The numbers are staggering when examined objectively. Between 1968 and 1972, the Phoenix program was responsible for the neutralization of over 81,000 suspected VCI members. Of these, approximately 26,000 were reportedly eliminated rather than captured or converted. The SEALs were not the only force conducting these operations. Army Special Forces, CIA paramilitary officers, and South Vietnamese provincial reconnaissance units all participated. But the SEALs earned a reputation that made even their allies nervous. A SEAL squad could infiltrate a village, eliminate a specific target, and extract without the neighboring residents ever knowing Americans had been present. The psychological impact on the VCI was enormous. Communist documents captured later in the war revealed standing orders for political officers to never sleep in the same location twice. Other directives warned against establishing fixed command posts in areas known to be patrolled by _8. The Phoenix program was controversial then, and remains controversial today. But from a purely tactical standpoint, it demonstrated what a small number of highly trained operators with the right equipment could accomplish. And that brings us to the weapon's darkest nickname: The legend of the hush puppy name. The official designation was Mark 22 Mod 0. The Navy documentation referred to it as the suppressed pistol, 9mm. But the operators who carried it into combat had their own name, and the origin of that name reveals the dark humor that sustained men in impossible circumstances. The nickname Hush Puppy came from one of the weapon's intended secondary uses. Dogs. Village dogs were the bane of SEAL operations throughout the Mekong Delta. Every hamlet had them. Mongrels that slept during the day and barked at anything that moved at night. A single alert dog could compromise an entire operation, bringing guards running before the SEALs could reach their objective. Standard procedure was to avoid dogs whenever possible, but avoidance was not always an option, and that's where the pistol earned its name. The Mark 22 provided a solution. A dog could be silenced from a distance that kept operators outside the animal's detection range. One round, minimal noise, continued movement toward the target. It sounds callous when described in peacetime comfort. But the men who carried these weapons were operating in an environment where a barking dog could mean the difference between mission success and a body bag. They named the pistol for its most frequent victims, and the name stuck. Decades later, long after the war ended and the weapon was declassified, veterans still refer to it as the Hush Puppy. The official name appears in manuals and museums. The nickname lives in the stories told at SEAL reunions and VFW halls across America. But the dogs were never the primary target. The men were. How the SEALs actually employed the weapon. Classified after-action reports, declassified decades later, paint a vivid picture of how the Mark 22 was used in combat. The weapon was never intended for general firefights. Its limited magazine capacity, slow rate of fire with the locked slide, and subsonic ammunition made it unsuitable for conventional engagement. The Mark 22 was a specialist tool for a specialist's job. Sentry elimination, close-range precision targeting, and the missions that officially never happened. A typical mission profile worked like this. The SEAL squad would insert several kilometers from the target area, usually by small boat or helicopter. Movement to the objective could take hours, conducted entirely at night, through terrain that would be impassable for conventional forces. The point man carried the Mark 22, often in addition to his primary weapon. As the squad approached the target perimeter, this operator would move ahead, sometimes alone, to clear the approach route. And then came the moment that separated SEALs from everyone else. Sentries were engaged at ranges between 10 and 30 meters. The locked slide configuration was preferred for the initial engagement, eliminating even the metallic click of the action cycling. After the first target was down, the operator would assess whether additional shots were needed before manually cycling the slide. This decision had to be made instantly, in total darkness, often while standing in water, or balanced on a narrow dike. One wrong call meant alerting the enemy. One hesitation meant a wounded sentry screaming for help. The reports describe operators making these calls correctly mission after mission. Dozens of sentries eliminated without a single alarm raised. Entire enemy compounds penetrated and objectives secured before the occupants knew they were under attack. The Mark 22 didn't just make the SEALs more effective, it made them invisible. The enemy's response. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were not stupid. They recognized that something had changed in the nature of American operations. Captured documents from 1969 describe increasingly paranoid security measures implemented in response to SEAL tactics. Sentries were doubled, then tripled. Guard rotations became irregular, with random timing designed to prevent pattern analysis. Some units began using challenge and response codes that had to be exchanged every 5 minutes, ensuring that any sentry who went silent would be immediately noticed. None of it worked. The SEALs adapted to every countermeasure. Double sentries meant 2 targets instead of 1. Frequent guard rotations created windows when attention was focused on the relief rather than the perimeter. Challenge codes meant nothing when the guard was down before he could give the response. And then the enemy commanders started losing sleep themselves. A report from an NVA battalion commander in 1970 describes the frustration in stark terms. He wrote that his men had begun refusing night sentry duty in areas where _12_ were known to operate. He requested permission to relocate his headquarters away from the river, citing the psychological impact on his troops. Permission was denied. 3 weeks later, his political officer was eliminated during a SEAL raid. The commander himself was captured 6 months after that. The interrogation transcripts from captured NVA officers provide some of the most compelling evidence of the Mark 22's impact. One lieutenant, captured in Kianjiang province in 1971, described his fear of the silent American weapons. He said that normal gunfire told you where the enemy was, gave you something to fight against. But the Americans with their quiet guns could be anywhere. You could lose half your men before you knew you were under attack. He had seen it happen. He had been one of the survivors, and his testimony was just the beginning. The technical evolution, marks and modifications. The original Mark 22. Mod 0 was just the beginning. As the war progressed and operators gained experience with the weapon, modifications were requested and implemented. The Mark 22. Mod 1 added a slightly longer barrel for improved accuracy. The Mod 2 featured a more durable suppressor design that extended the round count before replacement was necessary. By 1971, the Navy was also experimenting with different suppressor configurations that could be quickly attached and detached in the field. But the real innovations came from the operators themselves. Some filed down the sear engagement surfaces for a lighter trigger pull, improving accuracy at the cost of slightly reduced safety margins. Others added grip tape or wraps for better purchase in wet conditions. A few enterprising SEALs modified the slide lock lever for quieter operation, using rubber grommets to dampen the mechanical click. These field modifications were technically against regulations, but commanding officers generally looked the other way. Results mattered more than regulations in the Mekong Delta. The ammunition also evolved in ways the manual writers never anticipated. While the Mark 144 remained the standard issue, operators experimented with commercial subsonic loads that offered different performance characteristics. Heavier 158-grain projectiles for maximum energy retention. Lighter 124-grain rounds for slightly higher velocity while remaining subsonic. Hollow point variants that were officially prohibited but unofficially available through creative supply channels. The SEALs were pragmatists. They used whatever worked best, regardless of what the manual said. And then came the night that proved just how effective their approach had become. The night of the 27, January 14th, 1969. One of the most remarkable SEAL operations of the war, and a demonstration of what the Mark 22 could accomplish in the hands of a skilled operator. A combined SEAL and PRU force was tasked with striking a Viet Cong rest station in the Seven Mountains region. Intelligence indicated a large concentration of enemy troops, possibly including several high-ranking political officers. The assault force numbered just 14 men. They were about to face almost twice that number. The approach took 4 hours through triple canopy jungle so dense that movement could only be measured in meters per minute. The point man, a SEAL petty officer whose name remains classified to this day, carried the Mark 22 with 2 spare suppressors. As the force neared the target compound, he moved ahead to clear the perimeter. What he found was far more than expected. 27 enemy soldiers sleeping in hammocks strung between trees, with 3 rotating sentries maintaining watch. What this single operator did next defies belief. Over the next 43 minutes, he eliminated every sentry in sequence. 8 different guards, taken down one at a time as they rotated through their posts. Each engagement required the operator to close to within 15 meters, acquire the target in near total darkness, fire 1 or 2 shots, and then freeze in position while waiting for any response. There was none. The suppressors worked exactly as designed. The subsonic ammunition left no ballistic signature. The guards never knew their comrades were going down. When the compound was finally breached at 04:45 hours, the remaining enemy soldiers were caught completely by surprise. The firefight lasted less than 3 minutes. 18 enemy were neutralized, 4 captured, 5 escaped into the jungle. Among the captured were 2 VCI district-level political officers whose intelligence value proved significant. The official after-action report credited the success to superior planning and execution. The operators who were there credited the Mark 22. But even this remarkable weapon had cousins that were equally deadly. The weapon's classified cousins. The Mark 22 was not the only suppressed weapon in the SEAL arsenal, though it remains the most famous. The Navy also fielded suppressed versions of other platforms, each designed for specific tactical requirements. The suppressed Sten gun, a British design from World War II, was issued in limited numbers for situations requiring automatic fire. Its mechanical simplicity made it reliable in the harsh Delta environment, though its accuracy at range left much to be desired. More exotic was the suppressed high-standard HDM pistol, a .22 caliber weapon that had served OSS operators in World War II. The smaller caliber meant even greater sound reduction than the 9mm Mark 22, though at the cost of significantly reduced stopping power. And then there were the weapons that seem like they belong in a fever dream. The suppressed shotgun program produced several fascinating prototypes that saw limited field testing. Imagine a 12-gauge loaded with buckshot, capable of clearing a room without alerting the building next door. The engineering challenges were immense. Shotgun shells generate far more propellant gas than pistol rounds, requiring massive suppressors that made the weapons unwieldy. But reports indicate that at least a few successful operations were conducted with these experimental weapons before the program was shelved. And then there was the crossbow. Yes, you read that correctly. The silent alternative. Before the Mark 22 reached wide distribution, SEAL platoons experimented with even more primitive solutions to the noise problem. Crossbows were issued to several teams in 1965 and 1966, with the theory that a silent weapon would prove invaluable for sentry elimination. The reality was more complicated and far more terrifying. Modern crossbows of that era were hunting weapons, not designed for combat use. They were bulky, slow to reload, and required extensive practice to achieve accuracy under stress. But some operators made them work. The crossbow had one advantage that even the Mark 22 couldn't match. Zero mechanical signature. No click of a slide, no cough of a suppressor, no brass casing hitting the ground. Just the whisper of the bolt leaving the rail and the impact of the broadhead arriving at the target. Reports from this period describe crossbows being used to eliminate sentries at ranges up to 35 meters, with the bolts causing sufficient trauma for immediate incapacitation. The crossbow era was short-lived, ending almost entirely by 1967, when suppressed firearms became available in sufficient numbers. But it demonstrates the lengths to which SEAL operators would go to achieve silent lethality. They would have used sharpened sticks if that's what the mission required. The Mark 22 simply made their job easier. But mastering it required training that bordered on obsession. The training protocol proficiency with the Mark 22 required specialized training that went far beyond standard pistol marksmanship. Operators had to learn an entirely different shooting methodology. The locked slide eliminated the ability to rapidly fire follow-up shots. Miss the first round, and you had to manually cycle the action before trying again. In the time that took, an alerted sentry could unsling his rifle and open fire. First-round accuracy wasn't just important, it was everything. The training program at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado devoted significant hours to suppressed pistol work. Operators practiced in low-light conditions until they could acquire and engage targets by starlight alone. They trained in movement scenarios, engaging targets while wading through chest-deep water that simulated the Delta's canals. They practiced failure drills until the 2 to the chest, 1 to the head sequence became pure muscle memory. But the most important training couldn't happen on any range. Perhaps most critically, they trained with the actual mission profile in mind. Targets were placed at realistic engagement distances. Scenarios required operators to close from concealment, engage, and then continue movement without pausing to confirm the elimination. The training was repetitive, exhausting, and absolutely essential. By the time a SEAL arrived in country with a Mark 22 on his hip, he had already put thousands of rounds through similar weapons. The muscle memory was there. The confidence was there. All that remained was applying it against an enemy who had no idea what was coming. And yet, even this remarkable weapon had limitations that nearly cost lives. The suppressor's limitations. Hollywood has done the suppressed pistol no favors. Movies portray these weapons as completely silent, capable of being fired in a crowded room without anyone noticing. The reality is more nuanced. The Mark 22 was quiet. remarkably quiet. Quiet enough to be fired in one room of a building without alerting occupants in the next room. But it was not silent, and operators who forgot that distinction didn't survive long. The suppressor reduced the sound signature to approximately 37 decibels at the muzzle. Add in the ambient noise of a jungle at night, the rustle of vegetation, the chirp of insects, and the weapon became effectively inaudible beyond about 50 meters. But up close, within 10 meters, the sound was distinct. A mechanical cough. A heavy thump. Trained ears could identify it, which meant the weapon's effectiveness depended on speed as much as stealth. Eliminate the target before anyone close enough to hear could react. Move to the next position before the body was discovered. The Mark 22 was a tool, not a magic wand. It required skill to employ properly. The suppressors also required replacement after relatively few rounds. The wire mesh baffles that disrupted the propellant gases would begin to degrade after about 30 shots. As they degraded, sound levels increased. A suppressor that had been whisper quiet on round 1 might be noticeably louder by round 25. Operators had to track their round counts and swap suppressors before performance degraded to unacceptable levels. This meant carrying spare tubes, adding weight and bulk to already heavy loads. It also meant occasionally making difficult decisions about whether to engage a target or preserve suppressor effectiveness for a more critical moment later in the mission. But the weapon's greatest impact couldn't be measured in decibels. The psychological warfare dimension. The Mark 22's impact extended far beyond its direct tactical applications. The weapon became a psychological warfare tool of the first order. The mere rumor that SEALs were operating in an area with their silent pistols was often enough to disrupt enemy operations. Viet Cong cadres would abandon established positions rather than risk a nighttime visit from the water demons. NVA units passing through SEAL operating areas would maintain heightened alert states that exhausted their troops and degraded their combat effectiveness. And then the Americans weaponized that fear. Leaflet campaigns exploited this terror. Propaganda dropped over enemy territory warned that the Americans could strike anywhere, at any time, without warning. Crude drawings showed shadowy figures emerging from waterways, pistols extended, while enemy soldiers slept unaware. The leaflets promised that anyone who supported the Viet Cong would eventually receive a visit from the Silent Ones. How many enemy supporters switched sides based on these psychological operations is impossible to measure. But interrogation reports consistently mention fear of the SEALs and their quiet weapons as a factor in defections. The enemy attempted their own propaganda in response. North Vietnamese radio broadcasts described the Americans as cowardly assassins who skulked in the night rather than face honorable combat. This narrative gained zero traction among troops who had experienced SEAL operations firsthand. Being labeled a coward meant nothing to a sentry who had watched his comrades fall without a sound. What mattered was that the Americans could do things that seemed impossible, and no amount of propaganda could counter that perception. For decades, the weapon that created this fear remained hidden from history. The post-war declassification. For decades after the Vietnam War ended, the Mark 22 remained classified. Veterans who had used the weapon were prohibited from discussing it publicly. Photographs were restricted. Technical specifications were sealed. The Pentagon treated the hush puppy as though it contained secrets that enemy nations could exploit, long after the weapon itself had been retired from service. Declassification began in the 1980s, driven partly by the growing number of Vietnam SEAL memoirs that referenced the weapon without providing details. But the full story took another decade to emerge. The first official acknowledgement came in 1983, when the Naval Special Warfare Command released a brief history that mentioned suppressed pistols without specifying models or capabilities. By the early 1990s, retired Mark 22s began appearing at military museums, complete with information placards that would have earned their authors prison sentences 20 years earlier. The full story emerged gradually through oral history projects, declassified after-action reports, and the determined efforts of military historians. Veterans who had been silent for decades finally told their stories. The picture that emerged was both more impressive and more nuanced than the legend suggested. The Mark 22 was not a miracle weapon. It was a well-designed tool that, in the hands of highly trained operators, enabled operations that would otherwise have been impossible. And its DNA lives on in every special operations pistol used today. The legacy continues. The Mark 22 was officially retired from Naval Special Warfare Service in 1975, along with most other Vietnam-era equipment. But its legacy shaped every suppressed weapon that followed. The principles proven in the Mekong Delta, subsonic ammunition, lockable slides, purpose-built suppressors, became standard features of special operations firearms worldwide. The current SEAL inventory includes suppressed variants of multiple weapons, all descendants of the lessons learned with the Hush Puppy. But one weapon in particular carries the torch. The Heckler & Koch Mark 23, fielded in the 1990s, was explicitly designed as a modern successor to the Mark 22. It chambers the more powerful .45 ACP round, features an integral accessory rail for lights and lasers, and accepts a suppressor that reduces sound signature to levels the Vietnam-era operators could only dream about. But the mission profile remains the same. Silent elimination of sentries. Covert penetration of enemy positions. The tools change. The tactics endure. Veterans of Vietnam-era SEAL operations speak of the Mark 22 with a particular reverence. It was more than a weapon. It was a force multiplier that allowed small teams to accomplish what battalions could not. It was proof that technology, properly designed and skillfully employed, could overcome seemingly impossible odds. It was, in many ways, the essence of what made the SEALs different from every other military unit in Vietnam. And the men who carried it deserve to be remembered. The men who carried it. The Mark 22 was only as good as the operator behind it. And the operators who carried this weapon into combat were exceptional by any measure. They had survived the most demanding military training in the world. Basic underwater demolition SEAL training, where 75% of candidates quit or were eliminated. Jump school, dive school, land warfare training, language courses, and specialized instruction in everything from demolitions to field medicine. By the time a SEAL deployed to Vietnam, he represented millions of dollars in training investment and thousands of hours of preparation. But no amount of training could truly prepare them for what they faced. These men operated in conditions that would break ordinary soldiers. Weeks spent in the jungle without resupply. Constant immersion in contaminated water that caused infections, rashes, and diseases. Night after night of patrolling through terrain infested with snakes, leeches, and enemy troops. They returned to base looking like wild men, bearded and filthy, and were treated with suspicion by conventional forces who didn't understand their mission. The clean army saw the dirty SEALs and didn't know what to make of them. But when the bullets started flying, everyone knew who to call. The statistics of silence. Quantifying the Mark 22's impact is challenging because many of the operations where it was employed remain classified to this day. However, partial statistics have emerged through declassified documents and veteran accounts. The numbers tell a story that official histories tried to suppress. Between 1968 and 1973, Navy SEALs conducted approximately 3,500 direct action missions in Vietnam. Of these, an estimated 800 involved the use of suppressed weapons for sentry elimination or targeted neutralization. The success rate for missions employing suppressed pistols was significantly higher than for those using conventional weapons, with fewer casualties among friendly forces and higher completion rates for objectives. The weapon's record for mechanical reliability was equally impressive. In the harsh conditions of the Mekong Delta, weapons failed constantly. Saltwater, mud, and humidity conspired to jam actions, rust barrels, and render firearms useless at critical moments. The Mark 22, designed with these conditions in mind, maintained functionality rates exceeding 95%. Operators reported malfunctions only rarely, and most could be attributed to ammunition problems rather than weapon failures. These numbers tell only part of the story. They cannot capture the countless times a SEAL operator raised his Mark 22, acquired a target, and made the cold calculation that the mission required. They cannot convey the psychological weight of taking a human life at close range, silently, in the darkness. They cannot express the strange intimacy of that moment, closer than most combat engagements, personal in a way that artillery strikes and aerial bombardments never are. The men who carried the Hush Puppy understood something about war that most people will never know. And that understanding came with a cost that some are still paying. The controversy that never ends. The Mark 22 and its employment in programs like Phoenix have remained controversial for over 50 years. Critics argue that suppressed weapons designed for close-range elimination are tools of assassination, not legitimate military instruments. They point to allegations of Phoenix program abuses, including the targeting of civilians based on faulty intelligence, and argue that weapons like the Mark 22 enabled these excesses. The debate touches fundamental questions about the ethics of warfare and the limits of acceptable military action. Defenders of the weapon and its users offer a different perspective. They note that the alternative to silent precision was conventional firepower, often delivered in forms that caused far greater civilian casualties. An artillery barrage or airstrike on a suspected enemy position might eliminate the target, but it would also destroy the surrounding village. A SEAL team with suppressed pistols could remove the target surgically, leaving the innocent untouched. In this view, the Mark 22 was actually a humanitarian innovation, enabling discrimination that conventional weapons could not achieve. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between these extremes. The Mark 22 was a tool. Like all tools, its moral character depended on how it was used. In the hands of skilled operators conducting legitimate military operations against valid enemy targets, it was a masterpiece of tactical engineering. In the hands of those who abused its capabilities, it could enable terrible wrongs. The weapon itself was neither good nor evil. It was simply effective. And that effectiveness is what the historians missed. What the historians missed for years. The official histories of the Vietnam War focused on large unit actions. The Ia Drang Valley, Khe Sanh, the Tet Offensive. These were the battles that made headlines, that shaped public perception, that filled the pages of textbooks. The secret war in the Mekong Delta received barely a footnote. The SEALs and their quiet pistols were invisible, just as they were meant to be. This historical blindness had consequences. Americans understood Vietnam as a war of attrition, of body counts, of search and destroy missions that seemed to accomplish nothing. They did not see the surgical operations that dismantled the Viet Cong infrastructure one cadre at a time. They did not know about the enemy officers who were eliminated in their sleep, the intelligence coups that followed prisoner snatches, the villages that were freed from communist terror because American operators had removed the terrorists. The visible war was a tragedy. The invisible war was often a success. The Mark 22 was part of that invisible war. Every round fired from its suppressed barrel was a statement that there was another way to fight, a smarter way, a more effective way. The lessons should have been obvious. Small, elite units with specialized equipment could achieve decisive results. But the military establishment largely ignored these lessons for decades, returning to its preference for mass and firepower. Only in recent years, with the rise of special operations forces to prominence, has the wisdom of the SEAL approach gained wider recognition. And now, only the ghosts remain. The ghosts of the Delta. The men who carried the Mark 22 into combat are aging now. Many have already passed on, taking their stories with them. Those who remain gather occasionally at reunions, where the hush puppy is brought out and passed around with reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. They remember missions that still cannot be discussed publicly. They remember comrades who did not come home. They remember the weight of the pistol in their hands, the click of the slide lock engaging, the focus required to make that first shot count. They do not speak of their work as heroic. Heroes are people who rush into burning buildings or charge machine gun nests. What the SEALs did was different. It was cold, calculated, professional. They took pride in their effectiveness, not in any romantic notion of warrior glory. The enemy was a problem to be solved, and the Mark 22 was part of the solution. That was all. That was enough. But make no mistake about what these men accomplished. They operated in an environment that should have been impossible to survive, let alone succeed in. They faced an enemy who knew the terrain intimately and was fanatically committed to their cause. They received inadequate support, contradictory orders, and political interference that hamstrung their operations. And still they prevailed, mission after mission, year after year, using tools like the Mark 22 to tip the scales in their favor. The Viet Cong called them the men with green faces. The North Vietnamese called them water devils. They called themselves SEALs, and they earned that name in the blood and mud of the Mekong Delta. The hush puppy did not win the Vietnam War. No single weapon could have. But it gave America's most elite warriors an edge that their enemies never forgot. Decades later, the veterans who faced the SEALs in combat still speak of them with fear in their voices. They still remember the nights when sentries fell without warning, when death came from the water without a sound, when the Americans seemed less like soldiers and more like ghosts. That was the legacy of the Whispering Death. That was the legend of the Hush Puppy, Hush. And that legend will never be silenced.